Okay, so the starter for this lesson, match the images with the terms below. All of these relate to our lesson and the theme of our lesson today. You could do this activity on a scrap bit of paper, a whiteboard, a book, whatever you fancy, or it could be a silent reflection. Choice is yours. Match the images with the terms below. So C was number 1, financial. A was number 2, physical. B was number 3, psychological. And that means D is number 4, environmental. But what on earth could all of these things actually link to? Risk assessments. This lesson is about risk assessments. So how do these terms actually link to risk assessments, do you think? Pause the video here, have a bit of silent reflection, and then come back. They all link to the term risk assessment because these are the effects that can occur if an injury happens. So that's what they are called, the effects of a hazard. And we're going to talk about hazards and risks later on, but this is not new information. This is something we've done before. But you may not have seen these effects of hazards before: financial, physical, psychological, environmental. So again, these are all the things that could happen to an individual if they are hurt due to a hazard on a working site or even in everyday life. So let's go through these one by one just to make sure that we have a really good understanding as to what they actually are. So a physical effect, this is an injury, a sickness, or an illness that has occurred to the human body. This includes short-term and long-term. So for example, it could be a small abrasion or a small cut, broken limb, or a permanent ailment due to physical injury. And when we say permanent ailment, we're talking about a significant life change, such as maybe paralysis. Psychological. These are conditions that affect a person's mental health. So this could be something such as anxiety, shame, depression, or despair. Financial. This relates to the loss of earnings. This could be because someone has had to take time off work due to an injury or a sickness, having to pay fines for not meeting regulations, or paying compensation or having to pay to clean contaminated areas. And then environmental, this is anything that can harm the environment, such as pollution, air contamination, which includes dust and noise, and natural water contaminations, so lakes, rivers, and streams. But it can also include the discomfort to local towns due to noise, vibrations, and the feeling of confinement due to dust. So, for example, roadworks in a small town or a small village, dust can get everywhere. There are traffic queues constantly. Even some businesses will be affected as well. So those are the environmental effects of a hazard. Quick think. Give an example of a physical effect. So this lesson is all about risk assessments. Before we can discuss them in great detail, we need to know what a risk assessment is. So what is a risk assessment? Pause the video, have a little think, and then share your answers. A risk assessment is a formal document which is written before a practical task. It identifies the hazards and risks of that practical task, the control measures that are put in place, and also who is at risk. So who is the person who is actually going to get harmed. A risk assessment does not remove the risk, they aim to reduce it. And they do this by identifying the hazards and the risks involved in an activity. They identify who might be at harm. They consider how the risk could be controlled to reduce. And they also record and they review. So they always come back to these risk assessments annually to make sure they're still up to date and that all the appropriate control measures are still in place. So this lesson, we're going to complete a risk assessment on a practical activity, and the practical activity will be shown to you in the form of a video. And the sheet you're going to complete looks something a little bit like this. So watch the YouTube video link below. It's also in the description of this YouTube video if you're watching it on YouTube. Pause this video and then come back once you've completed it. Your task is on your risk assessment. I want you to identify at least 5 different hazards. So 5 things that could cause someone harm that you saw on that video. The video can play again if you need to whilst you're working, but make sure you are completing the task if it is shown again to you. So just once more, I want 5 different hazards, so 5 different things that could cause someone harm that you've seen in that video. So let's go through. What have we identified? Pause the video here. If there's people with you, discuss what you've seen, etc., or what you've written down, and then continue the video to reveal some answers. So these are the 5 different hazards that I've identified. So I identified the fact that a vehicle entering and exiting the site or the garden. I've identified that not all workers are wearing PPE, personal protective equipment, such as high vis or hard hats, goggles, etc. I've identified that the digger is raising heavy materials at a high height. I've also identified loose materials are on the floor. And finally, I've identified that there is a giant hole in the garden. So all of these things, these are 5 different things that could cause someone harm or injury. So now that we've identified our 5 different hazards, we need to explain what the risks are. So what do I actually mean by risk? Who can define the term risk? So a risk is the actual harm or the effect that can be caused by a hazard. So for example, a physical, psychological, financial, or environmental effect that can be caused by that hazard. So now what I need you to do on your risk assessment, I now want you to write a short sentence for each hazard that explains the risk that can happen. So for this hazard here, you're going to write the risk here so that it flows nice and beautifully along the sheet. Okay, pause the video here and complete that activity. Okay, so here are some of the risks that I identified from the hazards that I previously identified. I won't read through all of them, but I'll read through a couple. So the first one here, vehicle entering and exiting the site / garden. Someone could get hit by the vehicle and have a physical injury such as a broken bone. So that's my short sentence to explain the risk, so the harm, the effect that could be caused by that hazard. Then I'm going to go through a digger is raising heavy materials at a high height. So my risk is as the digger raises the material, some of it could fall out and land on someone, causing a physical injury like a cut or bruise or even broken bone. So that's the risk that I've identified. So it's a short sentence. You could argue it's quite a long short sentence, but it's still a short sentence. And I've included those technical terms, physical injury. I've always said it could cause a physical injury, or you could say it could cause a physical effect. So read through the remaining on the screen, but then also go back through your work. Have you included these technical terms, physical, financial, psychological, or environmental, if you need to, in your risk assessment? So pause the video here, read the remaining few, discuss, and then check your responses are technical. Okay, finally, now we need to do what we need to do now is we need to decide what control measures need to be put in place so that these effects can't happen to people. What do I mean by control measure though, and can anybody give me an example? It's actually on the sheet. So well done if anybody identified that. A control measure or control measures are ways of making activity safer by reducing or removing the risk. So E.G. safety signs. So we can't always remove a hazard. Sometimes it's always going to be there. So an example of that is on my risk assessment, I've talked about the digger and I've talked about vehicles entering and exiting the site. I need that digger to complete this practical task. Those vehicles have to come in and out off site. So in order for me to remove them as a hazard, I would need to remove them off site completely, but I can't do that. So we've got to think of ways that we can actually reduce the likelihood of someone getting harmed by one of these hazards. And going along the first one here, vehicle entering and exiting the site. To help reduce the likelihood of someone being harmed, we can make sure that everybody's wearing suitable PPE, such as a high vis. That could stop someone from getting harmed, as the vehicle driver is more likely to see that person as they're entering and exiting the site. So, on your sheet, I would now like you to write in the control measures that need to be put in place to help reduce or remove that hazard. Okay, so let's go over some of these answers. Or some of the suggested answers. So for vehicle entering and exiting site, I've then got my risk here. I've put all site workers should wear a high-vis jacket so they are seen by the driver. For the second one, which is not all workers are wearing PPE, I have put the employer should provide PPE for all sites and enforce that it needs to be worn, and a site manager could check this. For digger is raising heavy materials, I've put have a licensed worker operating the digger at all times, as well as an extra worker who can help keep the area clear when the digger is in use. You could also have signage put up. For loose materials on the floor, I've put use suitable equipment to pick up loose material off the floor and dispose of it efficiently, maybe such as a wheelbarrow. And then finally, for the giant hole in the garden, I've put place barriers around the hole in the ground so it is visible to all staff. And all of these control measures will then help to reduce the likelihood of these risks from actually happening. So it helps to prevent any harm being brought to any workers or anybody on site. So that was the risk assessment lesson. I hope it was successful and that you've taken something away from that. You can always practice this activity again on a new risk assessment worksheet and finding your own suitable video online on YouTube.